For the hands-on activity, we were using number lines to help us answer questions provided in a table. The first problem that we were given was 3 times a negative 2, and it's important to understand that that could be read as 3 groups of negative 2. And what we see here is we see the loops 3 groups of negative 2. So those 3 groups of negative 2, that would mean that our answer is a negative 6. So 3 groups of negative 2 is negative 6. That means that we could say 3 times a negative 2 equals a negative 6. Then we had 3 times 2, which can be read as 3 groups of 2. Each group is going forward 2 spaces at a time, and there are 3 of them in all. So 3 groups of 2 is 6, which means that 3 times 2 equals 6. We also had 2 more number lines. We had a negative 3 times a negative 2, and a negative 3 times a negative 2. You cannot have negative groups. So what we could say, we could use a negative, and we could read that as the opposite of. So when our first integer in a multiplication problem is a negative, we could say that that is the opposite of, and we would be left with, if we started with a negative 3 times a negative 2, we said the opposite of, which was that negative, then we're left with 3. Multiplication can be read as groups of, so that would be 3 groups of negative 2. So negative 3 times negative 2 could be read as the opposite of 3 groups of negative 2. We know that 3 groups of negative 2 was a negative 6. So to show this on a number line, we're going to show what 3 groups of negative 2 is to begin, and then we're going to draw a dotted line going to the opposite of that all the way up to a positive 6. So the opposite of 3 groups of negative 2 is equal to 6, which means that a negative 3 times a negative 2 equals 6. And for the last one, we had a negative 3 times 2. And again, that first integer is a negative. That could be read as the opposite of 3 groups of 2. And we know that 3 groups of 2 was 6, so the opposite of 6 is a negative 6, which means that a negative 3 times 2 would give us a negative 6. We should have noticed that when we multiplied 2 integers with the same sign, the product was positive. So when we had 2 groups of 3, or 2 times 3, our answer was 6. And when we had a negative 2 times a negative 3, our answer was still 6. So what we mean by same signs is we had a positive times a positive, which gave us a positive, and we had a negative times a negative, which also gave us a positive. Then when we multiplied 2 integers with different signs, the product was negative. So we had negative 2 times 3 gave us a negative 6, and then 2 times a negative 3 also gave us a negative 6. So when you multiply with different signs, the answer will be negative. If you multiply 2 integers with the same signs, you will have a positive answer. If you multiply 2 integers with different signs, you will have a negative answer. So a negative times a positive gives you a negative, and a positive times a negative gives you a negative.